Привit, moi, druzy. Hello, my friends. It's now been 400 days since the war in Ukraine began, and I mean the full-scale war. I don't mean the war that started in 2014. I mean the full-scale invasion, 400 days. And it's almost hard to believe that we're at 400 days. I think Putin thought that this was going to go the way of the Russo-Georgian War, which lasted for 5 days. In fact, the plan initially was for about 3 days to get to Kyiv, and then about 3 weeks to mop up, and the people would welcome them. And that's the problem with authoritarian regimes. They believe their own press. They, yes men tell the boss, yes, 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 all the way up to the top, and then they have bad information, and then they act on bad information. It could also go like the Second Chechen War, which went for a decade. And we're almost to a decade if you include the 2014. But the Second Chechen War went from 1999 to 2009, 3,653 days. I don't know what's going to happen or how many days it's going to be. Um, my crystal ball doesn't work like that, but I can tell you that whether it's 3 days or 3 weeks or 3 decades, I don't think that the Ukrainians are going to give up. We know that the 3 days and 3 weeks have passed, and then 2 days in, that's when Zelensky was saying, I need ammunition, not a ride. And people rallied to him. The Ukrainian people have a very um, freedom-loving spirit that it's um, hard to put a figure on how much that's worth, but it's absolutely amazing how Putin miscalculated and how willing the Ukrainians are to fight for their freedom. And it really is an existential threat for them. What I want to talk about is what's happened in the last 400 days. Who's lost what? Let's start with that. So Ukraine has lost something like, and this was the IMF figure about a week or two ago, 400, I think it was 411 or 440 billion. At this point, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's so astronomical in reconstruction. I mean, it's going to cost that to reconstruct. That's on top of the 100,000 or more, and that's just a very loose ballpark, killed or wounded, and that's on top of those that have been displaced, and that's on top of the tens of thousands of children taken by Russia and cities indiscriminately bombed, and the mental and emotional and psychological costs associated with being in a war-torn country. America's also paid a price as well, and this was a war that we were interested in or wanted to have or sought by any means. But we've Congress has authorized 113 billion dollars already. Now we've only spent 30, maybe upwards of 40 billion of that 113 authorized. Europe has also spent a lot of money in the process. Um, Inflation has been impacted. Less trade has impacted the economy, particularly in Europe. The idea of having to get off a cheap Russian gas and onto something else has added to that burden. But what's the alternative? Right? Like, I look at the amount that we're spending and I think, wow, we could spend that on other things. And that's what a lot of Republicans are talking about. We could spend this on other things. That's true. What's the alternative? What happens if you don't do this? Do you just let an authoritarian regime go on and do what they're going to do regardless of the consequences or how we get sucked in later? Because that's what will happen. And so there's a lesson. We're on day 400 right now because we did nothing about the 5 days in Georgia. And then we did nothing again in 2014. And when you let that go on, it goes on and it festers and it gets worse. And what we need to be doing is righting the ship, and we are, and we're paying a significant cost for it. What's happened in Russia, though? In Russia, they've gained something. They have illegally annexed these four oblasts, which they can't hold, and so they look kind of silly on the world stage. And they lost 200,000 or so dead and wounded, probably higher than that at this point. 1 million or so men have fled the country, and that has weakened them economically. Massive sanctions regime, unprecedented sanctions regime. China, their ally, has had this tepid response because they're hoping to pick up the pieces after it's done, and regardless of which way it goes. The Russians can't rely on Belarus. They couldn't really rely on them before, other than to be a bit of a threat. But now they can't even rely on them because they've stripped their military equipment. So for their own purposes, that the Belarusian army is no longer really any meaningful threat. So they're putting nuclear weapons in there, which they can't actually use. They can't use these nuclear weapons. I'm sure they've done the calculation, the cost benefit analysis of using a nuclear weapon and being a pariah to the rest of the world indefinitely. And their saber rattling with the nuclear weapons it's been the boy that cries wolf. They can't. There's no way to keep upping this. But they're trying, and it's not working well. Ultimately, Russia has pantsed themselves on the world stage. They look like this, second army of the world, and you've gotten bogged down really badly and shown yourself very poor performance. And I don't know, they're running out of munitions because they're firing way too many munitions at the wrong targets. They're firing at civilians, which are war crimes, which now has Putin coming to, well, not the war crimes. Putin's coming to the has a warrant for The Hague because of the children that they removed or displaced from Ukraine into Russia in what amounts to a genocide. But there's all these war crimes as well, and firing on civilian targets, dormitories, and other things along these lines to weaken the resolve of the Ukrainian people hasn't worked. They can't sell their gas and oil effectively. They are really struggling because about a third of their economy is based on selling these natural resources. The banking system is in shambles. They're cut out of the smart system, and they're trying to replace the system that relied on the dollar with other denominated systems, but it's not as easy as they think. Their banking system has to be crumbling, but somebody's lying somewhere about the numbers, because it just does not make sense that their banking system is still going to be effective given everything that's happened to them. And the world's united against them largely. Now, it's essentially the majority of the world versus a very small minority of Syria and North Korea and other authoritarian regimes, and then a few that are staying on the sidelines, mostly in the global south. So where's the good news? Well, the good news is that in spite of the destruction, on the first day when the bomb started hitting, the Ukrainians didn't just run. By the second day, Zelensky said, "I need ammunition, not a ride," and was unifying the people, and people were already moving toward the fight, not running away from it. The good news is that the world was uniting behind Ukraine. Ukraine has been an inspiration to the rest of the world, an example to the rest of the world. I mean, think about how difficult it was for the Americans to try to help the Afghanis defend themselves, to stand up. We could train you to do this, but they didn't really want to be trained to do this. They wanted to run away. Or think about the experience of the Americans in Vietnam as well. I mean, it's hard to get the people to stand and defend themselves. But the Ukrainians wanted to do that. They just needed the weapons in order to do that. I think we have an obligation to help them. Now, it's not over. The rest of the story has yet to be written. It's hard to tell how many more days how many more anniversaries. I mean, we're going to get to 500 days, certainly. I hope we don't get to 6, but it's probable. And we'll maybe get to other major landmarks in the number of days that we've been fighting in Ukraine. But it's not what the aggressors thought it would be. Day 400, they never anticipated it would be anything like this. And now they're kind of stuck. Now, we've avoided World War III, at least to this point, and I think the world is actually safer now. And I know that sounds weird, and some people are not going to believe me about that. Oh, no, we're moving to the brink of World War III. No, authoritarians now are on notice that if they do this kind of thing, guess what? They're going to get significant pushback, and things are going to go very badly for them. And authoritarians who only understand brute force have heard through a megaphone that this is a bad idea. So the world is actually safer now when authoritarian dictators see that free men fight back. It's also worth noting that you care enough to watch this. You care enough to support Ukraine in multiple ways. And I've been amazed when I heard how many different ways you all do things to support Ukraine. And good on you. You should be very proud of yourself for the ways that you've done that. The majority of us weren't even thinking about what was going on in Ukraine 400 days ago. And if we were thinking about it 400 days ago, most of us weren't thinking about it 500 days ago. Like, it wasn't even on my radar. I wasn't paying attention. And I now have 460 some odd videos about what's going on in Ukraine now because, when Zelensky stood up and said, "I need ammunition, not a ride," it caught my ear. Whoa, he's willing to fight. I believe that Ukraine will prevail. I think the spirit in Ukraine is very hardened toward freedom, and they will not go down without a fight. They're going to prevail. I can't predict how many days, but I'm encouraged by the will of the Ukrainian people. On this 400th day, I want to thank you for caring about Ukraine. I want to continue to urge you to pray for the Ukrainian people. Continue to push your legislators to support Ukraine. And I can't tell you how many times we're going to hit these landmark kind of dates, but I hope there are fewer of them and that the war is over soon with all the Russians out of Ukraine. Thank you for your time, and thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.